I'm always happy to introduce other SSA staff. This is Kate Donovan. She's our social media maven, and she studies at Northwestern University studying therapy.
Hey, I graduated.
Sorry. So yeah, I'm a little behind. But please help me introduce Kate Donovan.
Afternoon. I'm Kate Donovan. Sam gave me a wonderful introduction, and in about 2 sentences, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to smile, I'm good at this part, and stare pleasantly back at you, but I'm not going to speak for the next 30 seconds. And I ask you to wait without checking your phones, and just to sit and feel how comfortable or uncomfortable that feels. So you probably tolerated that in part because I've been asked to speak today. I'm standing up front. My name is in the speakers list. I have this nifty ribbon on my name tag, and I got an introduction. But in the first iteration of this talk, I wasn't going to do the talking first. I was going to walk up, and I was just going to wait and smile pleasantly for 30 seconds. And in fact, I decided not to do that at the very last minute because I was afraid that someone would sort of think I had stage fright or would want to come rescue me, and that it would be so uncomfortable for the audience that they would just sort of rush the podium and want to fix whatever was going wrong, that I wasn't talking, but I was standing up here and staring at you, and also that I looked okay with it. And it really was uncomfortable, wasn't it? I was sort of standing here, waiting, counting down. I was lucky enough I had the time in front of me, but 20 seconds, 10 seconds. Okay, now I can talk. And this is sort of something you might be familiar with if you are someone who pauses to choose your words. You wait a second, and someone steps in and tries to find the word you were looking for. Or if you have or had a stutter where someone just tries to provide the words and sort of keeps trying to fill in what you were going to say. And it is an impulse that we sort of all have. In research into conversations, at 3 seconds, someone wanted to fill in the gap and was uncomfortable when it was studied. And I made you wait for 30, 10 times longer. That's a really uncomfortable pause. If that happened in your conversation, you would probably be unsure of what to do. And of course, I was doing it to make a point, and so you tolerated it. And that point was that slight changes in how we interact, things like a really uncomfortable pause, can massively impact how a conversation feels. There are many ways in which a conversation is both about the words that are said and about the way that they're said. If you can imagine words that can be said in very different tones of voice, that will give you very different impressions of the conversation, where you can come away from one conversation feeling awful, and another conversation feeling neutral or good about it. And one of the things that is about forming a community with people, about creating relationships where you share parts of yourselves and create a space where people want to share parts of themselves with you, is that you have the conversations that don't have the uncomfortable pause or the discomfort about the tone, etc. And so it's easy to mess that up or to not be sure if you're picking the right thing. We're susceptible to what Cialdini called the click and whir. There's that uncomfortable silence and you just want to fill it. You just want the person to start talking or to be able to watch the clock to know what to do next or to check your phone. And it's just so easy to fall into trying to fix something instead of just sitting with the discomfort. And so if you remember how uncomfortable it felt to wait for those 30 seconds, just call that up for a second. That sitting with silence is uncomfortable, but I want you to hold on to it for the rest of this talk. If you can imagine for a second a time when someone came to you with something they were distressed about. Maybe they were freaking out about an exam, or they were going to break up with their partner and they weren't sure it was the right decision, or their partner just broke up with them or might be breaking up with them, or they couldn't tell if they were going to be breaking up with them. Or even a situation where you just heard someone give what was going on that was bad in their lives. You know, you've been in the large group where someone says, oh yeah, and my dad has cancer, and everyone just sort of freezes and doesn't know what to say. So there's the sense of wanting to say the right thing, but not knowing what that thing is. And a lot of the time, knowing what that thing is what can make a community out of, I mean, we're here because we want to have a student group that is a community, or maybe you have an off-campus group that you want to be a community. The difference between people who just came because they said yes on Facebook, and I guess that was an obligation and I am kind of part of this group, versus the people who came because this is the community where you get to share yourselves, and these are the people you confide in when you have secrets, or important things, or sad things to give to them. So I want to talk about, first, the importance of negative validation in those times when someone comes to you with the distress and you just don't know what to say in response. It's the opposite of positive reframing. So in that situation where someone came to you and they were freaking out about their exam, one thing you could say is, you know, exams don't count in the long term, or like, you know, you have good grades, and so this is just one part of your GPA, or, well, there are 3 other exams, so even if this goes badly, it'll be fine. That can be positive reframing, pointing out like, it's not so bad, or you'll get over it, or really in the long run, it doesn't matter. And that, in fact, can make people feel much worse and not much better. In research in a social psychology journal, when this was tested, people felt, particularly people with low mood or low self-esteem, felt worse for being given the positive reframing of what was going on in their lives. What can be much better is something called negative validation, which sounds terrible, sounds like it might be mean or making them feel bad, but in fact can work really well. So when someone says, I'm really freaking out about this exam, I'm terrified, you can just repeat almost that feeling back to them. Yeah, it sounds like that's really scary. Yeah, that can really suck. And it's the difference, to borrow a metaphor from Ali Broche of hyperbole and a half, it's the difference between pretending the fish are not there and agreeing that yes, the fish really do stink when they're dead. And you don't even necessarily have to agree with their read of the situation. We've probably all been in times where you really just think that other person who's stressed out just misinterpreted what was going on, or no, that person's pretty nice, like I really don't think it's as bad as you think it is. And instead of letting them know that, the sort of first thing you can say, without having to necessarily think that they should have exactly those emotions, you can say something like, it seems like it's really hard on you right now. And perhaps less emphasis on the seems than I just gave, but it seems like it's really hard right now, or it seems like that would not be a fun place to be in. That can be encouraging them to have the same feeling. Something we talk about in the atheist movement is this idea that, particularly for people in more religious areas, it can be so isolating to think that you're the only one with those doubts, or the only one who is an atheist. And then when you find the secular movement, you find all of these other people who can validate the same feelings that you have, or the same doubts, or the same experience of telling someone you're an atheist and getting a negative response, or not being sure how they would react when you said it. And so we all have sort of discovered the feeling of having people in your corner and having people go, oh yeah, that happened to me. Or, oh yeah, I was there and that was just like not fun. And I think that's a way that can be generalized to other conversations where someone is stressed out or upset that are not just about the secular movement. We know from our experiences in the atheist movement how good it feels to have a group of people who just sort of like nod and say like, yeah, that's really rough. And we can make our communities even better by doing this for other things. And another thing I want to talk about is often we do have good advice. So when someone comes to you and they're freaking out about the exam, maybe you've taken that exam before, or you totally know that feeling in sophomore year where everything is stressful because, oh my God, it's halfway through almost of your 4 years at school. And so what do you do then? And I'm not saying that that is unhelpful advice. In fact, you probably do have something of interest to contribute. But it may be that they have already considered this, that they know that there are lots of other exams, but this one, it just has that like 5% risk of tanking their grade, and that risk is terrifying even when it's 5%. And so I would encourage you to be good skeptics. And instead of sort of wondering, what can I do, and then guessing on one, finding out what you can do and asking if your advice is advice that would be helpful. So, and I'm not just thinking asking internally, I'm thinking going, oh, I think I know what to do, and saying, hey, I think I have some advice. I think I've been in your situation before. Do you want advice? And then listening to the answer there. It's the difference between, oh, you're uncomfortable and I want to fix it because I will feel better if I have said the thing that is what I want to give you. I think I know what the solution is. Let me give it to you. Or sitting with the discomfort of thinking you have the solution and finding out if that solution is something they want to hear about right then. It might be that at some point they do want to hear about how you survived your grandmother having cancer and the things you found to be helpful. But it might be that right now they know they'll be okay later, but right now everything is terrible and hugs would feel better. And so the importance of finding that out is what can create a community of finding out what other people want and how you can provide it for them. And the last thing I want to talk about is a little bit more motion-based. Not emotion, motion. But one of the things that has been shown to make people feel listened to or cared for has to do simply with body language. And I'm not going to get into all of the complexities of body language, but what I want to talk about is called mirroring. The idea of watching how someone else, it's something you probably do already with your voice tone. If someone comes up to you and they're super excited, do you say, yeah, it seems nice? When you want them to feel like you're getting into the mood with them? No, you probably match their voice tone and a little bit of their facial expression too, right? You know, maybe don't look quite so sad when they look very happy. And it's something you can also do with body language. In a really interesting research project, they had therapists sit with clients, and the therapists were told nothing to do differently except that whatever the client did with their right arm, the therapists were to do with their left arm. So if the client was sitting there, they were to become a human mirror just about their arm, so they weren't trying to focus on a ton of stuff. Just try to, you know, were they leaning on the table? Did they have it on their hip? Was it down in their lap? Were they like fidgeting a little bit? What was the client doing? And independent of everything else, those clients felt like they were being listened to more. They felt like they were more understood, and they felt like they were more cared for, like there was more empathy happening in those sessions and in sessions where that instruction was not given. And I think part of it too is that when you tell therapists, please imitate what your client is doing, you are also making them attend very much more to body language. But the importance of showing not only am I hearing what you're saying, but I am like feeling those emotions and I'm demonstrating that I'm feeling those emotions is important. So if someone is excited and they're like moving their arms, you can step in and be moving your arms. But if someone is sad and they're like sort of curled back or leaning back, maybe you don't want to lean into their personal space. You know, the I bet I have a solution for you. That can be a mismatch that is sort of under the conscious notice. And it's a way that you can really add more empathy to what you're doing. And it is a little uncomfortable. It's a little bit of something to add, to pay attention to am I doing this right? But it's something you can do. You sat with your discomfort with me 15 minutes ago for far longer than it takes to give some negative validation for a second, to squash the impulse to tell someone that everything will be okay, or to think about whether or not your advice will be needed. We're here at SSA East because we're part of this community. Many of us came quite far, one of us from South Korea. And we want to make more community, maybe make one at our school, or take the things that we've learned when we were at school to our communities outside of our degrees. And we want to make those communities that are not just about the pressure to come because you signed up on that meetup group that one time. We want to make them places that people care about, and ones that nourish each other. So when people share hard parts of their lives, you say, you're hurt? Let me sit with you and find out what you need. And so on that note, I'll ask you to pause with me for just 5 seconds longer. Thank you. So.
Thank you, Kate. Excellent presentation.
Go for it.
So one thing we did not touch on is the fact that it sometimes is legitimately difficult in a very painful, emotional way to listen to someone, you know, telling you really painful things. And I would like to know what you think is a good and graceful and sensitive way to deal with that situation.
Yeah, so to sort of reframe, the problem of, so you're really good at this empathy thing and now everyone wants to hand you all of the scary bad things, is a legitimate problem, and it's one that's really hard to talk about because, of course, I'm so good at helping people and people feel better when they talk to me. My life is bad is not exactly something people have sympathy for. So I think there's an important skill that Miri is referencing that is the stepping away from it. And I think it's possibly even a harder skill to develop. Some things that have worked for me, and your mileage may vary based on like your friend group and many other facets of how well this will sound like you, are things like saying, you know, why don't you send me an email? I'm really stressed and I don't think I'm going to be able to focus on what you're saying. The sort of, I care enough, but if you give it to me in an email, then I can get back to you when I have all of the energy. But maybe you don't even want to have that conversation with them. Maybe it really is that now 10 people have emailed you and everyone needs to stop with the email thing too. And so I think one of the ways that I have gotten a little bit better at this, but really have not gotten great at this, is in saying, you know, I've been in that place too, but right now I'm not doing so well. I can maybe give you some suggestions. But the sense of, I agree, I validate your feelings. I've been there too, but I can't be there right now. And here I can point you in other directions. So a sense of, I'm listening to you, but I'm listening to you in a direction that points you somewhere else, has worked fairly well for me. Of course, yeah.
No, you can go ahead and finish it.
I was just going to say, of course, people are better and worse at listening to this.
Okay, so my question was about, do you have any suggestions, I wonder, about how to make the meeting place, facilitate it into a space where support can be given on issues such as these? Because many of our meeting groups, the types of groups that we have, tend to be like intellectual discussions or like really frustrating talks about how some people dislike whatever about religion. So how do you think we might be able to transition that into a safe space where people can talk about whatever is upsetting them? And also, to what extent do you think this should be conducted in like the group atmosphere, as opposed to one-on-one?
Yeah, so multiple pieces of that. I think that in particular in groups where there is the dynamic of we have these kinds of conversations, it's really hard to brute force switch between the two. In part because you will have people who are upset because they're not having those like intellectual or the sort of conversations they expect out of the group. And so then they might be unhappy, which makes people very much less interested in saying like, I want to talk about what's going on in my life, knowing I make you guys unhappy about this, or knowing that there are audible sighs when I talk about what's going on. So I think part of it, yeah, is the cultivating the one-on-one. First, I think it's possible that this can become part of the group dynamic, that when people show up, we have this, some of us have become friends and we ask about each other. And so I think the first step might be the asking about each other. You're all showing up to the meeting and you say, hey, what's going on in your life? And like really do the listening cues, the mirroring, the sitting and asking if you can help. And that can then become part of the like pre-meeting dynamic that can then spread to, this is something we do and we love these conversations we have. Maybe we have debates every time, but we care about each other and so we show up and we're happy to see each other, and then we get into the thing we really love doing together. So I don't think it's necessarily an either or a thing that has to happen together. Yeah, go ahead.
You actually just mentioned one of them. You said people show up and they ask about it, they say, how are you doing, such and such. I spent a lot of time thinking about those kind of greetings that people give each other, and it's actually super depressing to me that we say, how have you been, what's going on in your life, and hi, how are you, and oh, it's great to see you, and these type of things, to the point that I don't think there's a person in the world who thinks that everyone actually means what they say in these situations. And I guess I was wondering if you had any insight to share, if there's any study, that sort of looks at these things. Is it better to abandon them, or is it better to make an exceptional effort to mean them every time you ask them? Because for me, I find that it has cheapened my level of interaction with a lot of people, and it has actually presented significant barriers to anything like a deeper sort of communication.
Yeah, I don't know of any specific research about keeping versus getting rid of them. But I think one thing that can happen that can let people have the boundaries, and maybe they really do want to say that they're fine because they don't want to have this conversation now, or if they have this conversation now they might cry and they don't want to be like crying in this meeting, or they feel like other people will be upset if they do so. So giving people the space to say like I'm fine and maybe like clearly not mean it. One of the sort of skills that I think can happen there is the good yeah, which is when someone says like I'm fine and you say like yeah, which you've said something, you've responded, you're not like just staring at them, but they can either elaborate about like, well, you know, actually things are bad, or they can say like, yeah, life's good. And you're giving them the choice to like tell you more about their lives or just keep going on, and the reins are now in their hand. So I think that's part of it. One of the skills I have cultivated, and I don't think I'm the only person in this room who's talked about doing it, is the idea of really trying to be accurate when people ask, but accurate in a way that doesn't make them feel obligated to respond. So giving them the sort of story arc of what's going on. Yeah, you know, it's been a little bit tricky, but I think I'm figuring it out. Or it's been a little bit tricky, but it's good to be here. And so they get the like, things are not perfect, but they don't necessarily then have to like dive into it, and they have the option to either go with the things are good here, or you're working on it, awesome. Or say like, yeah, what's up? And it gives them the choice of picking how much, like, are they in a place to deal with what's going on inside my brain, or how upset I've been for 3 weeks? Maybe, maybe not, but they can pick. And I think those two ways of having the sort of small talk conversation can make it small talk when it should be, because everyone's not in the mood or isn't close enough, or not small talk because you want to find out what's going on. Go ahead.
First of all, real quick, I want to mention that I'm a clinical social worker and I do these things at work each day. I'm really glad that you gave this concise, you know, like you don't have to be a clinical social worker or a therapist, that anyone can do some of this stuff, and it does help, because it really does help, it really does work.
Thank you.
My question is like, sometimes I worry about, this has kind of been alluded to already, reinforcing certain behaviors, that it can be really awkward. My student group a long time ago, there was someone who, you'd be in a very casual environment, you know, having conversation, joking, laughing, with multiple people there, and maybe let's say, give an example, like, someone would talk about being on the playground as a kid, and she would say, oh yeah, when I was on the playground as a kid, the other kids tried to hang me. Dead silence.
And then how does one, yeah.
I mean, like, maybe you're not sure that you want to reinforce this really inappropriate timing of certain self-disclosure.
Right, and then at the same time, you don't want to sort of ignore it because it is like large self-disclosure. Yeah, this is also a hard one for which I have sort of, maybe this will help, sometimes it works, answers, because I have been in a similar set of situations. The sort of catch-all phrase that I adapt to a greater or lesser extent is something I referenced earlier, the like, that seems really rough. But you don't necessarily then have to engage much more in the conversation. You can say like, yeah, that seems really rough. Pause, return to conversation. So you're listening, you're waiting, but you're not necessarily going, that seems really rough, tell me more about it. Let's all move the conversation into that. In particular because, I guess for the example there, it might be that people in the group really don't want to have the conversation about how they were bullied as a child and maybe don't want to share that part of their lives as much as the first person did. So yeah, that has worked some of the time because it gives the like, I'm not ignoring you, therefore you don't need to vie for attention more, but also I'm not letting you derail this conversation every time you do the thing. So that, yeah.
I feel like a lot of these sort of suggestions sort of rest upon the notion that most people are going to be able to read certain social cues, implicit ones, and I'm wondering whether it could be as effective or comparably effective to be explicit, to say, ask a question, say, you don't have to answer this question, but I'd be willing to listen if you like whatever you prefer, to actually say all these things that you're trying to communicate through these, these gestures and the tone of your voice, and be like, yeah, because someone might not actually know what, feel that that's inviting, because, not everyone reads the cues that way. Or is that sort of level of explicitness, because, we do operate on sort of like reading signals, would that be too off-putting?
I don't think so. So I obviously hang out in like some pretty general social circles that you guys know. So my guess is like not in the groups that I spend time around, but it's entirely possible it could be. I often do what you were describing, where I say like, yeah, you don't have to say more, but it seems like there's maybe something more. But I think it's true that sometimes that can feel a bit like pressure, the sense of like, oh, someone has noticed. And it's really hard to say, nope, I don't want to talk about it, particularly if you feel like it's someone for whom you should be able to talk about it. It's a close friend, but like right now you just don't want to talk about it. It can feel really hard to say nope. And that tends to be why with people I don't know very well, I default to like, yeah. And my guess there is, or at least my justification there is that people who really want to talk about something need a small opening. And so I'm sort of like guessing that by giving them a small opening, if they really want to talk about it, then they will say it. This doesn't leave room for people who are in the middle ground of like, I haven't decided if I want to talk about it. Maybe if someone asked me, I would, and maybe I'd feel better. But I think it does let people feel a little bit more protected about like acquaintance Kate, who is talking to them and might be interested in discussing it, but maybe not. Yeah, it's a hard problem. Which actually lets me recommend Real Social Skills is a Tumblr. It is called Social Skills for Autonomous People. And it is basically the best of its kind I've ever read, and I spend an embarrassing amount of time reading how to do social skills things. It's essentially someone decided to write down the steps of doing things or the steps of social interactions as they see the rules and then have conversations about them. So we wrote 10 paragraphs on how we think people want to make small talk and what does it matter about small talk that makes it work. One of the insights I got from someone having this conversation was that in small talk, what people really want is to match the general emotional tone, not so much the story. So if you say, oh, I just got into a wreck, my day is not so great, and the next person says, yeah, I was in a wreck last week, it can totally feel like you're trying to one-up each other. But if you say, yeah, I had a bad day yesterday and they're just really hard to recover from, that can be more of the tone thing. Or, yeah, and it's cloudy outside too, can be matching in tone, but you're not necessarily talking about car wrecks together. Yeah, Rita.
Would you say a little bit more about offering support when you've obviously hit the limit of how helpful it is to just be empathetic, and someone very clearly, maybe they ask for it, maybe they don't, needs more in terms of problem solving, that that's not going to be sufficient over the long term to feel better or think better, or be able to function better?
Yeah, that's an especially tricky one. So again, the things that I have found generally working are when I notice that it seems like things seem like terribly rough, and I think like I can maybe agree that things are terribly rough with you, but I can't offer the like solution that will help you. Or I can agree that things are terribly rough, but you need someone like having conversations with you regularly, or who isn't as involved in your life, or who isn't likely to get really busy and forget to answer their phone. I've said things along the lines, this is a little bit caveated by the fact that I talk about mental health all the time, and so people, I think, take this differently from me than from someone who doesn't spend a lot of time talking about therapy. But I say things along the lines of, yeah, it seems like this is a huge problem, and like I definitely want to talk about it more with you, but maybe you could do this other thing, or I have an idea, seems like, and suggests things like therapy. Campus services at the school I went to, Northwestern, were like pretty good for getting you the idea that you might need therapy during the first like talk or two. So finding a therapist, suggesting like, hey, it seems like maybe you could do more. Can I like call your friends, or can I call your parents? Or it seems like you could use more social support. I don't know that I can do this, but I've found this helped, or this other thing. Sort of the offering advice if people take it idea. That still is predicated on the idea that people will accept advice. If they say like, I don't want advice, then you are in many ways stuck, for which I haven't found a good solution. The idea of like, things are bad, I have advice maybe? No, I don't want advice. Yep, things are really bad is about as far as then I can go. So yeah, so thank you all very much.